to everyone who signed up to hear the official leader of the opposition speak to us in what we've termed a fireside chat. We have recorded quite a volume of questions that we'll be asking following his introductory words. I want to welcome James Byrne, a sponsor from MNP, looking after this today, and Bruce Williams, who will be our moderator, and myself, Kim Smythe, President and CEO of the Greater Nanaimo Chamber of Commerce. I want to also provide a territorial acknowledgement that we are presenting this from the traditional lands of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically Nanaimo, First Nations for Nanaimo, Stenaz for the Nanoose and North area, and Seminas for south of Nanaimo and the Cheminas area. We pay great respect for having the ability to live, work, and play on their territorial lands. Now, with no further ado, I'm going to introduce Bruce Williams, Victoria Chambers CEO and moderator for today, and let you take over and introduce Mr. O'Toole.
Great, thanks Kim very much. It's great to have the Chambers collaborate on this as we've done in the past. It's wonderful to get all of these people and perspectives together. I would too like to acknowledge that I am working and living in the ancestral territories of the Lekwungen speaking Coast Salish nations, in particular the Songhees and the Esquimals. And it's my pleasure to introduce the leader of the official opposition today to say a few words. I'm going to actually, James, did you want to say anything to begin, first of all, on behalf of MNP as the sponsor?
I've reworked my speech for the ending comment, so keep rolling, please.
Okay, right on. Good to know. The Honourable Erin O'Toole is joining us today, leader of the official opposition. A gentleman born in Montreal. He currently represents the area of Durham, which is in the eastern part of Toronto, sort of between Toronto and Kingston, around in that region, if you will. Studied law at Dalhousie University, also at one time went to Royal Military College, which led him into service into the Canadian Forces in the Air Command, where he was a navigator in Sea King helicopters on search and rescue operations. In the past, he's been the Minister for Veterans Affairs and the Critic for Foreign Affairs, and as we say, is now the leader of the official opposition. And you will have a chance to do some question and answer with Mr. O'Toole, but in the meantime, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and please open up with a few remarks. Mr. O'Toole, if you would.
Well, thank you very much, Bruce and Kim, and thank you to both chambers, Nanaimo and Victoria, for working together. Of course, I wish I could be with you in person. Not just because BC is very important to me personally, but Vancouver Island is truly one of the exceptional places in this country, and I hope to return soon. BC has played an important role in my life, and I talk about it a lot. I traveled as a kid with my grandfather by train to Expo 86. We had an incredible time, and that was my first time to visit Nanaimo, Victoria, and Vancouver Island as part of that trip. Years later, I came under less relaxed circumstances for training at boot camp in Chilliwack, and on the island later on, I did sea survival in CFB Comox. And in 2010, I was just talking about the incredible experience I had when I joined my wife in Vancouver for a month while she worked in the International Broadcast Center at the Olympic Games, and I was the lucky husband with tickets, including getting to see Alexandre Bilodeau win the first gold medal on Canadian soil at Cyprus. BC is a very special part of this country, and those games were an incredible Olympic Games that made the whole country proud. So I can't be there in person, but it's great to be here virtually to discuss the ways we can partner with your chambers, entrepreneurs, and communities across the country to plan for Canada's economic recovery after the pandemic. As leader of the official opposition, I have a job to do to hold the Liberal government of Mr. Trudeau to account. I try and do that with integrity and with respect. With the rise of more COVID cases occurring every day and with greater restrictions rolling across the country right now, potentially in British Columbia later today, we are all frustrated to see Canada lag the developed world in the deployment of vaccines. Canada used to be a leader, but increasingly it appears that we've become a laggard. I take no pleasure in highlighting these failures, these setbacks with the Trudeau Liberals. We wanted the government to succeed because Canadians need them to succeed. And when it comes to the health of Canadians, when that's at stake, I will always put the country first, and we have tried to do that throughout the pandemic. As we enter the grips of the third wave of the pandemic, our post-pandemic future seems a long way off, but we must plan now to secure our future, because the very future of Canada is what is truly at stake. Our country is at a crossroads. Which path do Canadians want to take? The path of Mr. Trudeau's reimagined economy, one where Ottawa makes decisions that will likely leave thousands behind, or the steady and certain path to securing our future, the path that will deliver us to a Canada where those who've struggled the most through this pandemic can get back to work. Recently, I introduced Canada's Recovery Plan, a plan to secure our future. Canada's Conservatives will enact a comprehensive jobs plan to recover the 1 million jobs lost during the pandemic within 1 year. And we won't stop there. We will take immediate action in the hardest hit sectors, helping those who've suffered the most, including small businesses, women, and young people. Nanaimo and Victoria, indeed the entire island, is heavily reliant on the tourism sector. Unfortunately, 87% of businesses in accommodation and food services report dramatically lower revenues last year. Some have already declared bankruptcy. We will need to rebuild the main streets of Canada to make sure that we assist small businesses to survive, to thrive later. We'll do that by providing incentives to invest in, rebuild, and start new businesses. The second pillar of our recovery plan, we will enact the toughest accountability and transparency laws in Canadian history. We must work swiftly to restore the faith of Canadians in our national institutions and in the government itself. Third, this last year has deepened the mental health crisis our communities have been struggling with across Canada. The Vancouver Island Crisis Society reported record-setting call volumes for the past year, receiving over 41,000 calls during the past fiscal year. A UBC study recently found that last year, 65% of respondents reported adverse pandemic-related mental health effects. This number is alarmingly high, and immediate action must be taken. The last year in British Columbia, as you know, there were 60% more deaths from opioids than from COVID-19. Each life lost represents a family forever scarred, and the promise of that life snuffed out. A few months ago, I showed my children the faces of lives lost due to the opioid epidemic when they were on the cover of the Globe and Mail. Coverage that showed young faces like Elliot Urchuk of Victoria, who was just 16 years old when he died in the opioid epidemic. We must do more as a society, and I've promised my children that we will. We will introduce a Canada Mental Health Action Plan and boost funding partnerships with provinces and nonprofit groups on the ground for mental wellness and mental assistance. Our fourth pillar of the recovery plan, we will ensure our country is never unprepared for a crisis again. Canada's Conservatives will make Canada more resilient, reduce our reliance on countries like Communist China, and take seriously our responsibility to protect the health of Canadians. That means domestic capacity for vaccines and key medical equipment. Finally, a Conservative government will secure Canada's economy by getting the budget back to balance over the next decade. Spending to protect Canadians during the pandemic is the right thing to do, and Conservatives have supported it in opposition. But we can't pass unsustainable debt to our children and to future generations. Once the recovery starts, a Conservative government will get spending under control, and we will get the economy growing again to secure the revenue needed to pay for the government services Canadians depend on. The decisions we take in the next few months and years will define Canada for this generation and the next. As the father of two, as I mentioned, My greatest worry is failing to leave a better, stronger, and more united Canada for my children. That is what drives me. Canada needs to realize that the next 2 decades, from an economic and trade standpoint, will be defined globally by a clash between the United States and Communist China. We need to position ourselves accordingly. The Trudeau government has been out of step now with 3 US administrations with respect to Huawei, with respect to the transshipment of steel and aluminum from China. Now the Trudeau cabinet is out of step on human rights as well. In this area too, Canada is lagging and no longer leading. We need to align human rights, trade, and other policies with the US and close allies like the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. We also need to expand our trade relationships with democratic allies in the Indo-Pacific. India is an important and is the world's largest democracy. Building trade with India will allow us to diversify our trade relationships to weather further potential disruptions with China. As we recover from COVID-19, it's time for certainty and competent leadership. It's time for ethical leadership in politics again. That's why every day I'm telling Canadians about the vision Conservatives have for a stronger, more prosperous, and more united Canada. Our party has a new leader, a new approach to outreach, and a plan to secure the future for all Canadians. Our recovery plan will get the economy back on track in Victoria, in Nanaimo, and across Canada to secure that future for everyone. Canada's Conservatives got us out of the last recession, and I know we can lead Canadians out of this one too. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole, very much. I mean, as you go through your life and your work life every day, you're watching what the government is doing. You're watching what the Prime Minister and the rest of them are doing every day to manage this crisis. Why would you want to do that? Why do you want to be the Prime Minister of this country?
Well, Bruce, I love this country, and I was raised with the values of working hard, striving to be the best you could be, and then using those talents to help your neighbors and help your community. I'm a middle-class kid from the suburbs, as you said, east of Toronto. I was taught to serve, and that led me to the military after high school. And when I left the military and got into the corporate world, it led me to start the largest charity for military families and our veterans. It led me to become a Rotarian, a member of the Legion, a member of the Vimy Foundation. Friday is Vimy Day, to raise funds for everything from hospitals to shelters, because to whom much is given, much is expected. And that's what led me into public life. I think Canada's greatest days are ahead of us, but it's going to require leadership. After 6 years of Mr. Trudeau, we're less prosperous, we're more divided at home, and we're less respected on the world stage. So I believe in the country, and I believe it's time for ethical, principled leadership. And while I may not be as well known as the current Prime Minister, I'm certainly happy to share my vision on how we can secure a future that includes all Canadians.
So the key to winning an election, aside from getting the most votes, of course, is that you have to deal with that element that's kind of the swing vote, right? There are people that in their lives make a choice between the Liberals and the Conservatives. There might be some who choose in their lives between NDP and Liberals. Not a lot of crossover between the NDP and the Conservatives. We have to grant that. So those swing voters watch very carefully what you do. And at your policy conference quite recently, the whole issue of climate change came up, and the party did not accept that as being, a majority of people voting didn't accept that as a real challenge right now. You must see that as kind of damaging in your opportunity to get some of those swing votes back over, especially among the people who do believe climate change is real.
Climate change is real, and we're going to have a real and serious plan to combat it. In fact, I've talked about this for many years, and I think we needed to put a more stronger position out in the last 2 federal elections. I'm going to make sure we do. The resolution at the convention was seized on by people that didn't realize we already have several other recognitions of climate change in our policy documents. The targets we're trying to achieve, set in Paris, were set by a Conservative government. this is going to be an area where we have a serious plan that is going to reduce emissions. And I look forward to not only outlining it before the next election, showing how it's a smarter plan. And I have a track record here as well. I not only did work on environmental issues as a lawyer, but also as a volunteer on conservation. And I think supporting a strong environment is inherently a conservative value. And I'm going to fight hard to win back people's point of view on that, including on Vancouver Island, where our environment and the natural environment is incredibly powerful. I'm also going to challenge you a bit, Bruce. There are a lot of crossover votes between NDP and Conservatives. In fact, probably nowhere more so than British Columbia, where there has been NDP provincial governments while there's been Conservative federal governments. There are voters who are hardworking, whether in natural resources, the logging, and in sort of small businesses and skilled trades that vote Conservative. They may vote NDP provincially. We want to reach out to them because right now, federally, there's only one party standing up for working families, and that is the Conservative Party. Whether you need a softwood lumber agreement, whether you value the job done by people who work in the natural resources sector, whether you want to help those Main Street businesses, many of which owned by families who are struggling, we value that nobility of work, which is why I'm actually trying to reach out to labor unions and to improve our relations, because I want their members to have work as well. And remember, there's also in Nanaimo Ladysmith, not Liberal or NDP switch votes. We're actually going after some Green votes in that seat.
Yeah, and in Sandwich Gulf Islands, you've also got a Green seat here with Elizabeth May being in power, and we have some Greens in our legislature here too. So just to continue on that a little bit, the Conservatives have not had a lot of luck here quite recently, honestly. You know, on Vancouver Island, the Greens have come in and taken some seats away from the Conservatives. The NDP took some away. The Liberals have no seats here right now. Do you have an island-focused strategy that you think will improve your chances here?
Yes, in fact, that's why I'm with you here today. I think the island is probably the most interesting political dynamic in all of Canada. And obviously I live politics. The island gave birth to the Dogwood Initiative. It also has people that are Conservative through and through. Years ago, the entire island was represented by Reform members of Parliament. We've had strong representation on the island in the past, and we will again. And I think this is why, with a new leader who understands the island and the need to get the balance right on resources, on the economy, on getting people back to work, while also having a serious plan on reducing emissions, taking climate change seriously, and fostering a positive environment for our children. I think we can get that balance right. A lot of the conservationists out there, hunters, farmers, a whole range of people are Conservatives at heart. So we have to tackle these challenges. And I think we're well suited to do that. And the island is very important to us. If I could be there in person, I would be, but we are reaching out. We will have a strong team representing us on Vancouver Island in the next election.
If I'm not mistaken, I believe you're the youngest party leader among Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Singh, and yourself. Is that right?
I think Mr. Singh is younger. Okay. My standard joke, Bruce, is I am younger than Mr. Trudeau. That usually surprises people. This is what a life of hard work looks like.
Sure. So the party itself has a bit of a heritage, and I'll just use very blunt language on this, of being the party of old white guys. You have to address that sort of diversity. It's of course reflective of our communities. It's respective of our population, or reflective rather of our population. How do you address that issue and that perception?
Well, I think you're going to see in the next election Canada's Conservatives running a slate of candidates from coast to coast to coast that looks like Canada of 2021. In fact, from my very first speech at 1:30 in the morning in Ottawa to a largely empty room because I'm the first COVID elected leader, I've said I want more Canadians from all backgrounds, all faiths, LGBTQ Canadians, Indigenous Canadians, everyone looking at our party because you're welcome in it. We want you to be part of our movement to build a great country and to tackle some of the challenges, particularly after COVID-19. And already we have an incredible diverse slate of candidates coming together that will be very experienced and will bring perspectives that will help our party reach the needs of today. And you might find this interesting, Bruce. Our party right now has the largest grouping of millennial members of parliament. And many of them have key roles in my shadow cabinet. Our shadow minister of housing, Brad Viss, in his 30s from Mission, BC. We have Raquel Dancho, who's 30, who's one of my lead on future workforce and inclusion. You're going to see more young people. You're going to see a cross-section of Canadians because I want the Conservative Party to be the home for more Canadians.
My background, as I think I mentioned to you, is media, and it's been pretty widely recognized that much of the media in Canada treads the middle ground. Some of them lean a little more left than others. There's not a whole lot leaning to the right. So for that reason, they will make a big deal out of things like the climate issue that came up at your policy conference. There's also a fair amount of coverage of the fact that there's a pretty prominent, fairly right-wing element to your party. You're more of a mainstream guy yourself, but there is this is a party that almost elected Maxime Bernier as its leader. So the right-wing part of the party gets a fair amount of attention. Do you think that there's damage control needed around that?
No, I've sent a very strong signal that there is zero room for intolerance or an approach contrary to inclusion in our movement. In fact, I've sent that clear signal from the moment I was selected leader. That is my track record. And I think we've all looked at the divisive politics in the United States and have been disappointed and don't want to see it return here. The Liberals are inviting US strategists to their convention. We had the largest virtual convention in Canadian history, where the third line of my speech, Bruce, was the fact that I think our party needs to change to meet the needs of today and to include more people in our mission. Right now, I'm probably engaging with a wider cross-section of groups from across the country than any party leader is. And part of it is building trust that I will do as a new leader. But I can tell you, when you see our slate in the next election, whenever it comes, it's going to be a passionate, talented, intelligent group of Canadians fighting for more opportunity for the country in the future. And I can't stress it enough. I want more Canadians in the next election who've never voted Conservative in the past to see a Conservative staring at them in the mirror the morning of the election.
Is this the right time for an election? The BC government, I'll just frame this up, called an election, of course, back in the fall, and got a lot of criticism for that, saying that it basically suspended the operations of government in the middle of a pandemic. Is now the right time for a federal election in this country?
We don't think now is the right time. No, in fact, I've been saying vaccines over votes. We're all disappointed to see where Canada is on the vaccine rollout. And sadly, that failure of leadership was on Mr. Trudeau's shoulders. Who in their right thinking would have last spring said, you know where I've got a partner for a vaccine to be made in Canada? I need to partner with a state-owned Chinese pharmaceutical company, CanSino. Mr. Trudeau has still not explained fully that botched partnership. The reason we're so far behind is we don't have domestic capacity, and the contracts that they won't release because they haven't been transparent show that Canada did not negotiate a swift supply of vaccines. That's why we're going to have a more severe third wave than some other countries have. The BC and some of the elections that got in last fall, there was a lull between the first and second waves, where I think the provinces that went to the polls did so safely and effectively. Right now, we're about to experience probably maybe even more severe restrictions than a year ago. So it's not the time for election posturing. And I hope Mr. Trudeau gets that signal. We'll work with them for the well-being of Canadians. And when an election eventually does come, we will be ready. He holds the keys.
You mentioned the vaccine supply. We could talk all day about that. It's always raised that it was a Conservative government that stopped vaccine production in this country. What's your answer to that?
That is a complete myth. In fact, the location where Mr. Champagne just made an announcement last week, a year late, but at least he made an announcement, was a lab that was enhanced and secured under a Conservative government of Mr. Mulroney. And in fact, there was increased investment and opportunity during the Conservative government of Mr. Harper. It was Justin Trudeau that a few years ago, using changes to the Patented Medicine Pricing Review Board, that basically was waging war on the sector. Add to that the decision to partner with CanSino. Of course, they've hidden most of the documents and contracts. When we tried to get documents, we're only getting them in dribs and drabs. They've hidden their own incompetence, Bruce, which is why this week I've called for a public inquiry that will take place after the pandemic, but let's appoint a monitor from the Auditor General's office today so that in real time, we can assess lessons learned. There's been no lessons learned by the federal government from the first wave of the pandemic till today. That's why we've been late on PPE originally, late on rapid tests, late on vaccines. There never seems to be the continuous improvement that we would see in the business community, my experience in the military. There needs to be leadership again in Ottawa, and I don't think we're going to get it from Mr. Trudeau.
You mentioned Mr. Mulroney and Mr. Harper. Do you consult with them now?
I've spoken to both over my 7 months as leader. I reach out to get perspective, and that's my style. I try and build a team. I try and make sure I know my files. I read the contracts. I've got experience in the private sector, including in regulated health products. I've got experience in uniform. As I said, I've lived and trained across the country, but I also know you can gain great perspective, particularly on improving the US relationship, fighting back against Buy American and some of the decline of our relations with the US in the last few years. I seek some of that input as well, and I've been fortunate that when I reach out, they're very generous with their time.
How often do you talk to the Prime Minister?
Mr. Trudeau?
Mm-hmm.
The last call we had was at my request about the US relationship with Mr. Biden. He knows from our work over the last year in Parliament, both before I was leader and since I've been leader, we're here to partner. So we've approved programs even when we knew there were large gaps. So we approved the wage subsidy, for example, and immediately tried to change the wage subsidy from 10% to 75%. We improved the rent subsidy approach. We approved the business load, the CEBA account, all of the programs that I'm sure the Nanaimo and Victoria Chambers have used and provided feedback for. We wanted to get support out the door quickly and then use the political process to push for improvements, to include more businesses in it. We still have some proposals with respect to highly affected sectors, tourism especially, and airlines. For 6 months, we've put out a series of ideas on how to provide certainty for those sectors. So the Prime Minister knows we're here to collaborate. The last call we had directly was at my request on improving the US relationship.
There's two ways an election could happen. One is that the Prime Minister pulls the trigger and makes it happen. The other is that you and Mr. Singh can get your seats together and vote them out, basically. Do you have that conversation with Jagmeet Singh at all?
No, I've spoken with Mr. Singh about the situation in Parliament and some of the issues with respect to the challenges the country's facing. I've spoken to Anime Paul as well, and had positive conversations. Je parle avec Monsieur Blanchet aussi. I speak with the bloc leader, but we have no intention to act in that regard. We have the intention on pushing for better programs, swifter assistance for some of these impacted sectors. making sure more Canadians aren't left behind in our recovery from COVID, which is why I don't like Mr. Trudeau's reimagine language. And when he talks about an economic recovery that could leave out large sections of the country, large groups of people. Mr. Singh has already said he'll support the budget. So I don't think there's a window that Mr. Trudeau can use the budget for an election, but he is really in the driver's seat. There is no Governor General to go to, as you know, Bruce, because even Mr. Trudeau didn't get that last election right either. So I'm glad they're returning to the Governor General Advisory Committee that we urged them to pick to choose the next Governor General. But the timing of the next election is really in Mr. Trudeau's hands.
Got any inside info on who the new Governor General is going to be?
You speak French, Bruce? No, I have no idea. I think there's a lot of positives to having an Indigenous Governor General. That's been suggested by many people. I think that could be a very big positive. Clearly, it's very important for the Governor General of Canada, a country with 2 founding languages, 2 official languages, to have the capacity in French and English. I think David Johnston was an exceptional Governor General, and he was picked by the committee that the Conservatives had put in place. So I'm glad to see Mr. Trudeau return to that committee. So I'm sure there'll be a number of names. That role needs to be someone who's going to be dedicated at serving this country. It's a demanding job, and so I hope they make the right decision.
Well, I got a name for you if you're interested. His name is Sean Atleo.
I listen. I have a lot of respect for Chief Atleo. When I was first elected, I got to meet him, and a lot of respect for him. And it was disappointing to see what happened when he lost the role. But there's a lot of respect. I've been doing a lot of outreach with Indigenous Canadians. My first question, Bruce, as leader of the opposition in Parliament, after I overcame COVID, because as a new leader, I caught COVID as the second wave embarked. My first day in the House, my first question was on reconciliation. We need to make sure that we get that right. And the Prime Minister, I know he's sincere, Mr. Trudeau, but when you make promises like the situation with boil water advisories on reserves, you have to have a plan, because reconciliation is as much about restoring trust after generations of that trust being eroded. So I hope to really make strides as Prime Minister in terms of our commitment to reconciliation.
Chief Atleo's an island guy, as you probably know. He's from Housat, originally lived in Nanaimo. Lives in
Coast Salish Chief, absolutely, yes.
Yes, yeah. Want to talk about the deficit in a minute, but before I do that, one of the things that our chambers here and many across the country are speaking on behalf of and advocating for is the continuance of the supports being offered by government for wage subsidy, rent subsidy, and that sort of thing. It's pretty much a lock now that those programs have to be extended. Is that going to happen, do you think? And do you support that?
I would agree with your assessment, Bruce. I think it's pretty much a lock. In fact, when Mr. Trudeau was talking to some officials in the Liberal Party and talking about an election after a budget, you'll notice they extended the programs to June. So it was almost like they had totally road-mapped their election plan. We've said, and part of my plan, my recovery plan, that remember, I think over the next decade, we have to get our fiscal house in order. We owe that to our children, have to be responsible. But up front, there is going to be more assistance needed, particularly with the wage subsidy. We've had several motions in the House of Commons where we brought debates on specific packages to help small business, to help tourism. There's going to be some particularly hard-hit sectors that will need help beyond an extension of the wage subsidy through an enhancement or an expansion of the CEBA program or some targeted measures. I always put it in this frame of mind. We need to get people working in all parts of the country and in all sectors to make sure our economy can recover. With $500 billion in debt accumulated in the last few years, with the highest unemployment or one of the highest unemployment rates in the G7, our prosperity is, the crossroads we're at is serious. We need people back to work. And with 2/3 of Canadians working for an SME, a small or medium-sized enterprise, if we have a wave of insolvencies, we're going to have chronic high unemployment as well, and we'll never tackle the budgetary pressures. So this is why we need all cylinders firing, why we've announced an ambitious 1 million jobs in 1 year. That will include extending some of these programs, Bruce, and even providing some specific assistance and packages to encourage full-time employment.
On the island here, we've seen tourism, of course, take a huge hit. It's just integral to our economy here. And many of the large employers, large operators, have not yet qualified for any sort of aid from it. What's the roadblock there? Why are the larger ones not being helped right now?
This has been one of our frustrations, and you've heard me say earlier, and I say this sincerely, I'm probably the first opposition leader in history that every day says, I want the government to succeed. I want them to succeed on vaccines. I want to see fewer insolvencies. I worked on restructurings as a lawyer. If that business survives, the jobs are saved, the pensions in some cases, the supply chain network. So I want them to succeed. But with certain programs like the highly affected sector capitalization program and others, there's big numbers announced and then a huge pause before there's any details. And my friends at MNP and some of the advisory firms would know this because they put out updates on this. And then a level of complexity to access the program. I think what we saw in the US with some of the measures, they were quick to access and quick to uptake. And they weren't a made in Ottawa solution. They often leveraged the private sector better. And that's what I think we need, because even HASCAP and some of these programs, the large employer fund, have only been accessed by a few players. A lot of companies find out they don't qualify, but find out several months later after thinking they're going to be saved by a big dollar announcement. So as Prime Minister, I will be less about the photo ops and the announcement. I'll be more about the follow-ups and the delivery, because politics is not about the razzmatazz of Twitter. It's about helping people that are struggling.
I'm going to go to some questions from attendees right now. Mr. O'Toole, I'm concerned with your comments today that more restrictions may be in order for BC later today. You've also referenced the challenges with mental health, which have been exacerbated by these very restrictions. At what point would a Conservative government take a look and recognize that shuttering things down is not the best solution when one considers the effects on the wider population? Last Friday, Good Friday, I visited a local store and found it busier than I've ever seen it. At the same time, small businesses with good systems in place for health and safety remained empty. I hope to hear you say that your government will not support ongoing shutdowns that destroy lives and dreams and create havoc on mental health.
Thanks for the question. As the meeting was starting, there was discussion about potentially more restrictions in BC because they've just been announced in my province of Ontario today. Right. None of us like to see the restrictions. Let me be absolutely clear. And this is part of the fact that we're very slow. We're 44th, 45th place in the vaccine deployment, means we're going to have a more significant third wave than some countries that are better prepared. And as a G7 country, as a country that 100 years ago gave the world insulin and has been a life sciences leader, we deserve a better outcome. When it comes to the specific decisions, I'm not interfering with provincial decisions that they're doing to try and promote the health and well-being of their population. I know that from speaking to many of the premiers, many of them are struggling with getting the balance right. And I know the inherent unfairness when you see some of the big box stores open and mom and pop stores struggling. We have to get the balance right. That's why we need vaccines. We need rapid tests as well, because when we can get through this third wave, we're going to be living with variants and a whole landscape where we're going to have smart opening up. So we need to also have a federally run rapid testing and screening process. So what I always try and do as a leader is not interfere in other areas of provincial or municipal jurisdiction. It's how can I partner so that we can have fewer business failures, fewer restrictions? Where is the federal government dropping the ball? At the beginning, it was the border. We were too slow, and then it was slow with masks. Then it was rapid tests and and vaccines. That's why I've called for the appointment of a monitor. We can never, again, be left unprepared like we have been this last year.
Yeah, we're having a tough time out here with rapid testing because it's not really happening. The national debt. Many people believe the massive deficit and increase to our national debt did not need to be as severe as it currently is. This kind of relates to the question about the ongoing relief programs. What would be the key changes you would make to help tackle the rapidly increasing national debt?
Great question. And this is why we have the 5-point recovery plan. Canada needs to plan now to get our economic house in order to make sure we lead the world in the economic recovery from COVID. And the 5th pillar is an approach to get our fiscal house in order over the course of a decade, because as I said, we'll need to help people up front and make sure that the economy survives so that we can get people working, grow the economy and our GDP, and then address the spending in a way that's fair and equitable. The spending, we've tried to, as I said, support the government in their programs to help Canadians with the CERB, the wage subsidy, all of them, and then tried to improve them. Was there spending that was out of control? Yes. The WE scandal, trying to create a program where you were going to pay people to volunteer. The altruism of volunteering is your payment, right? And so that was backwards. It was being orchestrated by people that had been paying honorariums and things to the Trudeau family. There's a whole scandal there that they don't want people looking at. But even, was it appropriate to have 15-year-old students that were dependents of their parents on a student version of the CERB? Was that a smart use of funds? When small businesses were struggling, I proposed supercharging the Canada Summer Jobs Program and flowing that funding through small businesses, including tourism and others that had a brief period where they were operating, particularly last summer. So we've tried not to let dumb decisions of the government get in the way of us helping get funds out the door to help people, but we need to spend smarter. There needs to be transparency on the tax dollars of Canadians, and a plan to not let this debt get out of control, because if interest rates go up in a few years, Mr. Trudeau's approach is putting healthcare at risk, putting old age security at risk, because we would have a debt crisis on the horizon. So we have to have a responsible approach.
Speaking of debt, we talked about housing for a second here. I'm going to combine a couple of questions that we received. Can you outline what you plan to do to address housing affordability and your view of the Canada-China FIPA agreement? Do you believe that housing affordability and/or the China-Canada FIPA and other agreements between Canada and China harm small business? What role do you see the Honourable Michael Chong, recently sanctioned by China, taking in this future government? And with the cost of housing increasing at an alarming rate, especially here, there are bidding wars on the rise. What's the federal responsibility for housing, especially at a time when we're also undergoing economic recovery?
Okay, thank you. There's a lot there. I'll try and get to each of them. The housing crisis, access, affordability, first-time home buyers being priced out. It's most acute in BC. It's also acute in my region of Southern Ontario, the Greater Toronto area. And the supply issue obviously is provincial and municipal led. That needs to be a key part of it where it can be. But as I said, I have my shadow minister of housing is a young member of parliament from British Columbia, Mission Masque Fraser Canyon, Brad Viss. He's coming up with a series of policies that will look at 3 aspects of this. One, the first-time home buyer, and how can we make sure that next generation doesn't have to forego the chance to own their own home. There's a number of ways to free up capital and to help. The second is affordable housing. How can we partner better with municipalities, nonprofit organizations, and the provinces? This is another area where the federal government has launched big programs, but the dollars haven't gotten out the door quickly. And then there's people at risk. And as I said, in terms of the opioid crisis, mental health, a range of people that when people are getting into the near homeless, where they're not able to afford, they're couch surfing, how can we have programs to help people before the cycle of addiction or mental health leads them to being homeless and really at risk? So I think there's so many different layers to it. We're going to have a very detailed program on it. The FIPA with China is not very well understood, but put it this way, a Chinese state-owned enterprise like CanSino that Mr. Trudeau was going to partner with for the vaccine, Canada has a free and open court system. We all know that Madame Meng is free on bail, living freely in Vancouver, one of the world's great cities. Our two citizens, the two Michaels, are in horrific conditions. Our legal system allows these companies to bring a court action for a commercial dispute or something in a BC Superior Court and Ontario Superior Court. We have the most transparent and accessible justice system in the world. It's not the same case for exporters with a commercial dispute in China. So the FIPA was about trying to take disputes out of that jurisdiction to provide our exporters with certainty. Certainly in the last few years, with the continued slide by Beijing into some of the worst aspects of communism with respect to human rights, the rule of law, the two Michaels, Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, the genocide, any of these agreements are very difficult with China. With respect to Michael Chong, I'm very proud of my team, and Michael's an outstanding shadow foreign minister. A great personal story where his father came to Canada from Hong Kong, challenging circumstances, and became a physician. His son is in Parliament. Canadians died defending Hong Kong, and I visited their grave in Saiwan War Cemetery in Hong Kong. So we have to have a principled stand and show the world our values are not for sale. We also have to show that Chinese Canadians and Asian Canadians have been experiencing horrific and unfair intolerance, and we have to send a signal that our disputes with the communist ideology in Beijing has nothing to do with the millions of Canadians who make our country better. So we have to make sure that we don't see a rise in hate crimes and other aspects of what we've seen in the last few years.
Thank you for that. Just in our last remaining moments here, I want to go through a couple of things and combine a few questions together. One concerning seniors in long-term care, to maintain that they are well supported, not just in their quality of care, but their quality of life. How do you plan to resolve the undeniable systemic issues in our healthcare system, especially in LTC? We have one of the highest rates of death in long-term care homes in the world from COVID, and over a year of restrictions imposed on a very vulnerable population who have contributed their lives to much of our comfort. We owe our seniors much more than we're currently able to offer. How does your party plan to improve that across Canada?
We have to improve it. And that's part of the reason, Bruce, that I called for a public inquiry so that we can show Canadians that we're going to learn the lessons and address the areas where we were short, where we were unprepared, and commit to it now. Have a monitor. And this inquiry will engage the provinces in the process as well, because of course, with the first wave, once COVID got into Canada and then it got into the long-term care environment, the most vulnerable were at risk and we weren't ready for it. How can we remedy that? I know that the provinces, all parties want to address this, so we need to show Canadians it will be serious. Last March, early March, there was one Canadian saying that we needed to get the military ready to deploy into our health and long-term care systems. That person was mocked at the time for saying it, to have a war footing to help our most vulnerable. 2 months later, we ended up doing that. The person was me, because I know what our men and women in uniform can do. We have medics and we have field ambulance units across the country. We had to take this crisis serious from the beginning and protect our most vulnerable. So this will be an area of very much importance for our government if we have the good fortune of forming a government.
And speaking again on that military theme, you in your time of service would no doubt have seen possible reference or evidence of the sort of activity that's being scrutinized right now within our Canadian military, the neglect and the abuse that's happening with people in the LGBTQ community, or the people that are Black, Indigenous, people of color being discriminated against, sexual harassment, sexual assaults. What is going to have to happen in the military for that sort of thing to get cleaned up and stop?
It requires leadership, Bruce, and the leadership starts with the Prime Minister, and then making sure that we have ethical, accountable leadership at the highest ranks of our Army, Navy, and Air Force. And I'll tell you, I'm a conservative that stands for the rights of all Canadians. I've always stood for the rights of the LGBTQ community as a brand new MP, for example, because I served alongside Canadians from that community, from all walks of life, men and women that were willing to put their life on the line for their country. So we owe it to them to be able to serve with dignity and respect. In fact, the Canadian Armed Forces should be the beacon on the hill on how we can achieve the best promise of this country. Because as I've said, I'm just finalizing an article on Vimy Ridge, which, 104 years ago, Canadians took. It forged the modern identity of Canada. There was a Japanese Canadian there. There were Indigenous Canadians there. There were immigrants, even for a new country, who would come back, especially some of our Indigenous veterans, and not even have the essential rights of citizenship, yet they went through the horrors of Vimy. So as an institution, as a veteran myself, I will demand accountability and an ethical, principled leadership. I think we can reverse this decline. And as I've said, Canadians are losing faith in some of our institutions, from the Prime Minister's office to the Canadian Armed Forces, and we have to restore that.
Wrap it up. Let's bring it on home. Let's bring it back to Vancouver Island. What can we do here? What could you do to make sure that the economy here stays diverse and robust, that we can attract the investment we need to grow our economy, to diversify it, to be more of an inclusive and a sustainable economy? We have both the advantage and disadvantage of being an island, and that is a factor for us here. We don't necessarily align with the mainstream manufacturing economy that drives the rest of the country. We don't even have food sustainability here. So we have all of these things to look at. What can we be doing? What would you suggest the government could do to better support the island economy?
Well, you have incredible food there in food security, because in the Comox Valley, I've spoken to folks, dairy farms, beef. I think one was even a yak or something, and some have their own distilleries. Buffalo. And there's an incredible diversity within the economy of Vancouver Island, because Vancouver Island itself is an incredible cross-section of this country. And so I think what you can do at both the Victoria and the Nanaimo chambers is continue to come up with solutions that help your members. We need to make sure that we have a recovery in all parts of the country. Tourism, as I've said, was in my speech and in my remarks. We've been advocating for a predictable plan for tourism, for the airlines, for some of the highly impacted sectors that will likely be struggling for some time or at minimal revenues. We want them to survive so that when life does get back to normal, they can thrive. So keep advocating, and I want you to know, whether it was my last time on Vancouver Island for the final flight of the Sea King helicopter, my sister squadron 443 in Pat Bay.
443, yeah.
Yeah, I was 423 in Shearwater. Right through to the folks I've met in the agricultural community, in the resource community, Indigenous leaders I've met. It's an incredible part of our country. And so I can't wait till I can get out there. And I want you to know Vancouver Island matters. And we're going to be putting forward an exceptional slate of candidates. And this is why engaging with your chambers is so important for me as a new leader. I want you to know that I understand some of the challenges that your members are going through, and I want to partner with them to secure a strong future for their families.
Mr. O'Toole, thanks very much. To wrap it up, I'm going to hand it over to James Byrne, who is the MNP guy in charge of it all, to his office in Nanaimo. James.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. We know that the recovery from the pandemic will not be easy, and that there are many uncertainties and unanswered questions for us. I believe these types of sessions are key, and that we hear from public policy makers and influencers like Mr. O'Toole to have a meaningful discourse about what we want to see from a recovery and how we can build a stronger, more resilient business community across Canada. Listening to Mr. O'Toole, the idea of leaving a legacy of being better and stronger and aligning these objectives strategically, both domestically and globally, I think are ideals that all Canadians and business owners can get behind and support. Of course, how do we get there is going to be the challenge for all of us. Myself and my colleagues from our 5 MMP offices on the island are committed to supporting our clients and the business community as we move from response to recovery. We're optimistic that our business community will be able to build and grow so we can continue to be the backbone of the economy here on the island and across Canada. We thank you for your time and sharing with us today, your thoughts and some of your platform ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Kim. Be well, everyone.
Thank you. Kim, we'll pass it back to you to close it, or are we done here? Oh, you're on mute. We all need a shirt that says you're on mute.
And supposed to be a mute jar here for a loony every time I miss it.
Okay.
So that's what I'll pay for vacation with if I ever get to take one again. 3 words that you used, Erin, at the close of your speaking here really mattered the most to me, and matters the most to everybody that Bruce and I look after in our business communities here on Vancouver Island. And that were the 3 words: Vancouver Island matters. I thank you very much for those words. I thank you very much for taking the time to be with us here today, for caring about business on Vancouver Island, and for sharing your concerns about the rest of the nation. Thanks, Bruce, for another excellent experience having you moderate here today, and for collaborating with the Nanaimo Chamber. And thank you so much, James, for your support, allowing us to do this here today. So everybody have a wonderful day. We're hitting 1 p.m. on the dot here on the West Coast. So goodbye to all, and thank you to the participants.
See you all. Bye.
Stay safe.